I poisoned my stepbrother's life with the same methodical patience he used to poison mine, and now that it's finally over, I need to confess everything before the guilt of justice becomes unbearable. His name was Julian, and he destroyed me so completely that I forgot what it felt like to be whole. Not with violence or cruelty that anyone could see, that would have been too simple, too easy to prove. Instead, he used words like weapons, each one perfectly placed, each one designed to slip past everyone's defenses and lodge itself somewhere vital. He whispered doubts into ears I trusted. He planted seeds of suspicion in the minds of people who loved me. He made sure that when I finally fell apart, everyone would assume I was falling apart because of my own failures, not because of what he'd systematically done to destroy every part of my life that mattered. The worst part wasn't what he took from me. It was that he made everyone believe he never took anything at all. I was 26 when it started. Not when the revenge began, that came later, years later, but when the slow unraveling started, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I didn't understand that my stepbrother had developed a strategy. That he'd been watching me, studying me, waiting for the exact moment when I'd have the most to lose. That moment arrived on a Tuesday in March when my father called to tell me he was marrying again, and her son would be moving in with us. Before Julian arrived, my life felt solid. My father had raised me alone after my mother died when I was 6, and the two of us had built something unshakable. He was a radiologist, disciplined and quietly proud, and he passed those qualities to me. I was in graduate school studying environmental science, engaged to a good man named Marcus, surrounded by friends I'd known since college. The apartment I shared with Marcus overlooked the Willamette River, and every morning I'd wake up thinking about how lucky I was, how the hard parts were behind me, how the rest of my life was going to unfold exactly as I'd planned. My father met Julian's mother, Catherine, at a medical conference in San Francisco. He called me the night before he brought her to meet me, and I could hear something I'd never heard in his voice before, uncertainty, but also hope. He'd been alone for nearly 2 decades. He deserved happiness. I convinced myself I was happy for him. Julian was 28, 5 years older than me, which I thought might make things less complicated. He wasn't moving into my father's house as a teenager, awkward and territorial. He seemed polished, successful. He worked in tech venture capital, the kind of person who could talk fluently about market trends and disruption and innovation. He had an MBA from Stanford. He dressed like someone who made decisions that moved money around in significant quantities. When my father first introduced us at the restaurant downtown, Julian stood up from the table and pulled me into a hug that felt warm and genuine, and he said, "I've heard so much about you. My mom is excited to finally have a sister." The word sister should have meant something to me. Instead, I felt something that I would later recognize as danger, though at the time I mistook it for something else, anxiety, maybe, or the reasonable discomfort of meeting a stranger who would suddenly be part of my family. But there was something in the way his eyes held mine just a fraction too long, something in the smile that didn't quite reach the corners of his mouth. I filed that moment away in the part of my brain where I store small warnings that I usually ignore. My father married Catherine 6 months later. Julian moved into the guest house on my father's property in the West Hills, ostensibly while he figured out his next move after leaving his venture capital firm. He said he wanted to spend time getting to know the family again, reconnecting with his mother after years of being consumed by work. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something a good son would do. I had no idea that he'd already calculated exactly how to dismantle my life, or that the demolition was about to begin. The first thing he did was befriend Marcus. He started appearing at our apartment unannounced, always with an excuse. He'd been in the neighborhood, he'd brought wine, he wanted to invite Marcus to a basketball game or a poker night. Marcus, who was good-natured and lonely in the way that people who work long hours in software engineering can be, welcomed him enthusiastically. They started having conversations that lasted until midnight. Marcus would tell me about things Julian said, ideas Julian had about startups, stories about Julian's time at Stanford, about the women he'd dated, about his philosophy on success. Julian was performing the role of the older brother who takes you under his wing, and Marcus was eating it up. I remember the first time I felt the actual shift, the moment I realized something was wrong. It was 3 months after the wedding. We were all at my father's house for Sunday dinner, and I mentioned casually that I'd been offered a position at an environmental consulting firm, a job I'd been interviewing for over the course of 2 months. It was the dream opportunity, the kind of job that usually goes to people with more experience, and I'd somehow managed to impress them enough that they were taking a chance on me. I was supposed to start in June. Julian congratulated me warmly, asked detailed questions about the work, the company, the pay. He seemed genuinely interested. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table. My father raised his wine glass and said he'd always known I was capable of extraordinary things. That was the last time anyone in my family would believe in me for the next 3 years. The conversations with Marcus must have started very soon after that dinner, though I didn't realize it at the time. Julian would casually mention things he'd heard about the company, rumors really, nothing concrete. The CEO had some legal troubles years ago that never quite got resolved. There'd been ethical questions about their environmental impact calculations. He wasn't saying they were actually bad, just that he'd heard some concerns, and he was sure it was fine, but he thought I should know what people were saying. Marcus would relay these things to me with concern, as if Julian had been doing me a favor by giving me a heads up about potential reputational damage. But Julian was clever. He never said anything definitively. He never made accusations. He only ever expressed concern, worry about my career, fear that I might be making a mistake. He was so thoughtful about it, so careful to frame it as protective advice from an older brother who was looking out for me. What I didn't know then was that Julian was having other conversations too. He was talking to my father about the job market, about how hard it was to get jobs in consulting these days, about how many promising candidates got burned by firms with bad cultures or unstable finances. He was texting my college friends things like, "How's Margot doing with everything?" Which made them think something was wrong, which made them start to worry, which made them pull away from me slightly, sensing some problem they couldn't quite identify. He was working on Marcus too, in his own careful way. He'd mentioned things about my family, little criticisms dressed up as jokes. "Margot's dad is kind of controlling, isn't he? Always has some comment about what she's doing." He'd suggest that I might be the type of person who was afraid of success, that I sabotaged myself. He'd tell Marcus about how much pressure my father put on me to be perfect, painting a portrait of a woman who was fundamentally fragile and self-destructive, though he'd never use those words. He was too smart for that. The night it all fell apart is crystalline in my memory. June had arrived, and I was supposed to start my job in 2 days. I was excited and terrified in the way you are before major life changes, the way that makes you feel alive and vulnerable all at once. Marcus and I were lying in bed, and he said, very carefully, that he needed to talk to me about something important. His voice had that quality that voices get when they're about to deliver information that changes everything. He said he was having doubts about our engagement. He said that over the past few months, he'd started to realize that we wanted different things in life. He said he thought I had too much pressure in my family, that my father had set unrealistic expectations, and that those expectations were going to ruin us. He said he loved me, but he wasn't sure I loved myself enough to be the kind of partner he needed. He said he'd been talking to Julian a lot, and Julian had really opened his eyes to some things he'd been ignoring. I remember standing up from the bed. I remember the room tilting slightly, though nothing in the room had actually moved. I remember asking him what Julian had told him specifically, and Marcus starting to backtrack, saying it wasn't about what Julian said, it was about what Marcus felt, but the way he hesitated told me that whatever I was feeling in that moment was justified. Julian had poisoned him. He'd taken everything Marcus loved about me and convinced him it was a problem. By the next morning, Marcus had moved out. By the end of the week, I'd called the consulting firm and told them I couldn't take the job. I didn't know why I did it, only that everything felt so unstable, so wrong, that the idea of starting a new job while my engagement was imploding felt impossible. The HR manager at the firm seemed disappointed, and I realized later that someone must have called them too. Someone must have shared some version of the story that made it sound like I wasn't reliable, wasn't mentally stable, wasn't the person they'd hired. My father was disappointed in me. He said that I'd had everything and I'd thrown it away, that I was throwing away opportunities that other people would kill for. He said that my mother would have expected more from me. That was the moment I realized Julian had gotten to him too, had told him some version of events that made him believe I was self-sabotaging, that made him disappointed in me for the first time in my life. I moved out of the apartment I'd shared with Marcus within 2 weeks. I found a studio in Southeast Portland, a neighborhood I could barely afford, and I went to work at a retail store because it was the only job I could get without references, without the networking contacts I'd burned through, without the ability to explain what had happened without sounding like someone who was making excuses. For 3 years, I stayed in that studio. I made minimum wage and tips. I watched from a distance as my father and Julian built a closer relationship, as Julian positioned himself as my father's confidant, his advisor. I watched Julian convince my father to make him a partner in the medical practice's investment portfolio. I watched Julian slowly separate my father from his other friends, from the life he'd built before Catherine arrived. And I watched as every friendship I'd had slowly evaporated. People would run into me around the city and they'd be friendly but distant, and I'd know without them saying it that they'd heard something, that Julian had gotten to them too. He was so good at it. He'd plant the seed, and then let it grow without him having to do anything else. The garden of his lies had spread so far that I couldn't see the edges of it anymore. But during those 3 years, I was also doing something else. I was watching him. I was noticing things that no one else was noticing because everyone was too busy believing in Julian to look at what he was actually doing. The shift in my perspective happened gradually. It started when I ran into my father's business manager at a coffee shop in Multnomah Village. She seemed nervous to see me, and over the course of our conversation, she let something slip, a comment about how confusing the investment reports had become since Julian had gotten involved, about how the numbers weren't adding up in ways that made sense to her anymore. She looked immediately regretful, like she'd said too much, and she left quickly. But I held on to that moment. I started paying attention to things I could see. I followed Julian's social media, which wasn't hard. He was one of those people who documented his life meticulously, who posted about expensive dinners at restaurants in Portland, trips to wine country, new clothing, new technology. But I also noticed that his job situation seemed oddly vague. He was always talking about consulting, but he didn't seem to have regular employment. Yet he was spending more money than someone without a job should have been able to spend. That's when I did something that I'm not proud of, but which I've never regretted. I hired a private investigator. It took my savings from 3 years of retail work, but I did it. I told the investigator to look into Julian's finances, his employment history, his current income sources. I told her to look into what he'd been doing with the investment money from my father's portfolio. What she found, over the course of 6 weeks, was that Julian had never actually left his venture capital firm. He'd negotiated a special arrangement where he was still earning his full salary and bonus package while officially being listed as on leave. What she also found was that he was moving money from my father's portfolio through a series of accounts, nothing so obvious that it would trigger immediate scrutiny, but enough that over the past 2 years, he'd transferred approximately $400,000 through various accounts and into investment vehicles that he controlled entirely. He was stealing from my father. He was stealing from my father while he was lying to me, poisoning my relationships, destroying my reputation, all while positioning himself as the golden child who could do no wrong. I spent another 6 months in a state of planning that felt like meditation. I didn't rush. I didn't do anything that might alert Julian to the fact that I'd figured out what he was doing. Instead, I collected evidence. I hired a forensic accountant. I documented everything, printed out everything, organized it in a way that would be impossible for anyone to refute. I made sure that everything I had could be handed to a lawyer or to the police and would stand up to scrutiny. But here's the thing about revenge, the real kind, the psychological kind that actually works. It can't just be about justice. It has to be personal. It has to force the person who hurt you to face what they did, not just to face consequences, but to face themselves. So I decided I was going to make Julian confess. Not to the police, not to lawyers, but to my father. I was going to make him confess everything, what he'd done to me, and what he'd done to my father's finances. And I was going to do it in a way that would make him understand that I'd known all along. That I'd beaten him at his own game. The opportunity came on the evening of my father's 60th birthday. Catherine had organized a dinner at a restaurant in the Pearl District, nothing too elaborate, just family. My father had invited me weeks in advance, had written it in an email with a warmth that suggested he was trying to extend an olive branch, trying to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship over the past 3 years. I'd accepted immediately, knowing exactly what I was going to do. I wore a black dress that made me feel powerful. I styled my hair carefully. I walked into that restaurant knowing that by the end of the evening, everything would be different. My heart was beating in a rhythm that felt violent, but my face was serene. Julian was there early, of course. He always positioned himself as the thoughtful, attentive stepson. He stood up when I arrived and pulled me into a hug, and I let him, and I even hugged him back, and he whispered in my ear, "You look great, Margot. It's good to see you." His voice was so warm, so genuine, that for just a moment I wondered if I was wrong about everything. That's how good he was at this. But I wasn't wrong. I had the evidence. I had the forensic accountant's report, printed and folded in my purse. I had documentation of every single lie, every manipulation, every moment he'd poisoned someone against me. During dinner, my father gave a speech. He talked about family, about how grateful he was to Catherine for bringing new joy into his life, and he mentioned Julian specifically, saying how much it meant to him to have a son. He said it made him feel less alone, less like a man who'd missed out on certain things because he'd been a single parent for so long. He looked at me when he said this, and there was sadness in his expression, sadness that I'd somehow failed to be enough family for him, sadness that he'd had to go looking elsewhere for the connection he wanted. Julian reached over and squeezed my father's shoulder, and my father patted his hand, and the whole table smiled at this touching moment between stepfather and stepson. I set down my fork very carefully. I took a sip of water. And then I said, very quietly, "I'd like to show you all something." I pulled out my phone, and I had a folder of screenshots already loaded. I started with the financial documentation. I watched as my father's face changed, as Catherine leaned over to see what was on the screen, as Julian's expression went through a series of subtle shifts, confusion, then recognition, then a kind of panic that he was trying very hard to hide. "Julian," I said, and my voice was steady in a way I wasn't sure it would be, "has been moving money from your portfolio for the past 2 years. Not borrowing it. Not investing it with your knowledge. Stealing it. Approximately $400,000. My father looked at Julian. For a moment, there was silence, and I could see him trying to make sense of what I'd said, trying to reconcile this information with the image he'd constructed of Julian in his mind over the past 3 years. "She's lying," Julian said, but his voice had lost its warmth. "She's clearly unstable. This is exactly the kind of thing." "The documentation is real," I said. "I've had it reviewed by a forensic accountant. I have the account numbers, the transfer dates, everything. And that's not even the main thing I wanted to talk about." I took another sip of water. My hands were steady. That surprised me, but it also made sense. I'd been preparing for this moment for so long that now that it was happening, there was nothing left to fear. 3 years ago, I said, Julian systematically destroyed my engagement and my career. He did it very carefully, very methodically. He told Marcus lies about me. He told my college friends lies about me. He called the consulting firm that hired me and said things that made them question whether I was stable enough to work with their clients. He convinced my father that I was self-sabotaging, that I was throwing away opportunities, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Julian was shaking his head. That's insane. You have no proof of. I don't need proof to your satisfaction, I said. I need proof that my father can understand. And I have it. I have the IP addresses from email accounts that were created using your information. I have the testimony of people who will confirm that you called them. I have the messages you sent Marcus on the night he left me, retrieved from his email account before he deleted them, because apparently he was stupid enough to think nobody would ever look at them again. I turned to face my father directly. He destroyed my life because he thought he could, because he thought I was weak enough that I wouldn't be able to fight back, because he wanted you to think he was the only child you needed. And while he was doing that, he was also stealing from you. Those two things are connected. He needed me to be damaged and unreliable so that nobody would believe anything I said if I ever found out what he was doing. Catherine was gripping my father's arm. Julian was trying to stand up. I watched him, and I felt something like pity, which was almost as surprising as feeling nothing at all. I could go to the police, I said. I could file charges. I've been gathering evidence for 18 months specifically so that I could. But I haven't, because I wanted you to understand what happened first. I wanted you to know that I'm not the one who's been destroyed by all of this. I rebuilt myself. I found a job at a nonprofit doing environmental work. I got my own apartment. I made new friends. I didn't fall apart, even though Julian did everything he could to make me fall apart. Julian was trying to leave the table, but my father had grabbed his arm. His face was a map of betrayal, of all the trust he'd placed in someone who'd been actively stealing from him while pretending to be his son. The police will know within the week, I said. I'm giving you the courtesy of finding out first, from me, before the legal consequences start. But Julian needs to understand that I didn't win this because I destroyed him. I won because I was smarter and more patient and more willing to wait for the right moment. I won because he underestimated me, just like everyone else did. I stood up from the table. I was shaking now, all the adrenaline finally catching up with me, but I kept my voice level. You tried to make me invisible, I said to Julian, and now I was looking directly at him, and our eyes met in a way they hadn't in 3 years. But invisible people are the most dangerous ones. They see everything. They notice everything. And when they finally decide to act, there's nothing you can do to stop them. I left the restaurant before anyone could say anything else. I drove to my apartment and I called the forensic accountant and I told her to forward everything to the police. I called the lawyer I'd been consulting with and told him to file the civil suit. I called a reporter I'd been speaking with anonymously for the past month and told her that the story was ready to break. The legal process took 9 months. Julian was arrested. My father had to testify against him. Catherine left him almost immediately. By the time the case went to trial, Julian had lost everything, his freedom temporarily, his reputation permanently, his access to the family wealth and security that he'd built his entire identity around. But more than that, he had to live with the knowledge that he hadn't beaten me. He had to live with the understanding that the person he'd spent 3 years trying to destroy had been the one orchestrating his destruction the entire time. He had to face the fact that for all his intelligence, for all his manipulation, for all his careful planning, I had been more intelligent, more manipulative, more careful in my planning. I had won, not through violence or cruelty, but through the simple application of patience and strategy. My father and I have repaired our relationship. It took time, and there are still moments when I can see the shame in his face, shame that he'd been manipulated, shame that he'd believed someone else over his own daughter. But we're working through it. He's in therapy. I'm in therapy. We're both trying to understand how someone could convince us to doubt the most important people in our lives. The question that haunts me now, the question I'm confessing because I don't have anyone else to confess it to, is whether I'm still a victim or whether I became something else entirely. When you plan revenge for 18 months, when you hire investigators and forensic accountants, when you coordinate with lawyers and reporters to time the maximum destruction of another person, at what point does survival become something uglier? At what point does justice become cruelty? I told myself that I was just fighting back, that I was just using intelligence and patience the same way Julian had used manipulation and lies. But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that I enjoyed watching him fall. I enjoyed the moment when he realized that he'd miscalculated about me, that he'd underestimated my capacity for long-term thinking and strategic planning. I enjoyed the way his face changed when he understood that he was the one who was going to be destroyed. And I'm not sure if that makes me strong or if it makes me just like him. What I do know is that I'm alive in a way I wasn't before. My life is mine again, not in the way it was before Julian arrived, but in a new way, a harder way, a way that required me to look directly at darkness and decide that I was willing to be cruel in order to survive. I'm working at a consulting firm now, not the one I turned down, but a smaller one where I've built a reputation for competence and intelligence. I have friends, though the friendships are different now. They're with people who know what happened and chose to believe me anyway, or who I met after everything fell apart and who know me as someone who survived something difficult. I'm stronger now. I'm also harder. I'm more suspicious. I assume people have ulterior motives. I plan 3 steps ahead of every conversation. I've become strategic in a way that feels like armor but also feels like a prison. But most of all, I'm free. Julian can't hurt me anymore. He can't destroy my relationships or my reputation or my opportunities. He has to live with the consequences of what he did, and I have to live with who I became in order to make sure those consequences were delivered. Every day, I wonder if that trade-off was worth it. And every day, I decide that it was, even as I recognize that deciding that has probably made me someone I never wanted to be. That's the confession I needed to make. That's the truth I've been carrying since the moment Julian's lawyer called to tell him that the trial had a date. I won. He lost. Justice was served. And I still don't know if I'm the hero or the villain of this story.